Okay, Berger 2009. Now this is your contemporary study for the social approach, and it's really important that you understand that, because that means that Berger will not be named in the exam. It might be referred to as the contemporary study from the social approach, and you need to identify that that's Berger and be able to answer the question knowing that the answer refers to Berger. Now, Jerry Berger in 2009 was really interested to see whether participants today would still obey. So he wanted to see whether if he replicated Milgram's 1963 original experiment, would participants still obey. Now you need to again be able to outline and describe the aims, method, procedure, results and conclusion of Berger, and also be able to evaluate the study in terms of strengths and weaknesses. Now what Berger tries to do is he replicates Milgram's study, but he also tries to correct some of the errors or the things that he thinks Milgram's missed. Now in this case, obviously Milgram was particularly unethical. Milgram's shocks went all the way to 450 volts, and his participants were seen to become quite distressed within the later stages of this. Now Berger points out that any of the participants who did drop out, who did refuse to continue with the experiment, had already dropped out by 150 volts, and anybody who went past 150 volts went all the way to the end. Now it's really important to remember here that I'm referring to variation number 5. Now this is not one of the 3 variations of Milgram's experiments that you need to know, but it is important to understand that Berger's study is based on the replication of number 5. Now number 5 is where at 150 volts the learner starts talking about heart condition and saying, I will not continue, please do not make me go any further, I've got a heart condition. Now Berger calls then this 150 volts this point of no return, because he says anybody who is willing to go past 150 volts, it can therefore be assumed that they would have gone all the way to 450 volts. So in Berger's study, he only makes participants go up to 150 volts, and he draws his conclusion based on whether they were prepared to go past 150 volts or whether they stopped before them. Berger is also interested in factors that he says Milgram missed. Now these are cognitive factors, particularly empathy and locus of control. Now empathy is somebody's ability to put themselves in somebody else's shoes or somebody else's position, and he wants to see whether empathetic individuals would feel sorry for the learner and therefore stop sooner. Now, locus of control, if you've got a high locus of control, then you resent being ordered about and you're much more likely to rebel, or that's what Berger thought and that's what he wanted to test. Now, Berger has a very scientific approach because he uses this idea of empathy and locus of control as an extraneous variable that he says Milgram didn't control. Now Berger argues that by controlling this extraneous variable he's able to draw a much better cause and effect relationship between the IV and the DV. Now Berger measures these traits, this empathy and locus of control, by giving all participants a questionnaire beforehand to see how high or low their empathy or locus of control is. And then at the end he wants to see if there's a statistical link between these scores and between how many shocks the participants were willing to deliver. Okay. The aim of the study is to see, there's 3 aims you can see on the screen. He wants to see whether Milgram's study, whether the results of that study would reoccur when it's, much later, 2009. He wants to see if they would still be the same. He wants to see if these personality variables, this empathy and locus of control, will influence obedience. And he also wants to see if the presence of a disobedient model would make a difference to the obedience levels. Now his IV, which is manipulated, you can see here, is whether it is a base condition or whether there's a rebellious partner in the room. He uses an independent groups design, and his DV, which he's measuring, is exactly the same as Milgram, and it's measured by how many volts that is given by the teacher. Now this time Berger uses 70 participants. You'll notice he uses a mixture of men and women. He puts the participants within the 2 conditions, and they're recruited through a newspaper ad, just as Milgram was. Now he pays his participants $50 before the study started. Now this is really important because Berger uses this to argue that he therefore gives his participants the right to withdraw at any point. Some of the critique of Milgram's study was that by paying the participants afterwards, they felt the need to continue in the experiment so that they got paid. So Berger tries to address that by paying the participants at the beginning. All of Berger's participants were aged 20 to 81, and Berger actually recruited a lot more participants than he used, but what he did was he screened the participants first. Now, he did this to check that the participants hadn't heard of Milgram's study or research before, because obviously if they had, then they would behave differently. He made sure he didn't have anybody who'd studied psychology for more than 2 years, and he made sure he didn't have anybody with anxiety issues or drug dependency issues, because he argued that if they did, they'd get a little bit more distressed within the experiment. Okay. Berger replicates Milgram's baseline study, so he uses the standardised procedure that Milgram used within 1963. So his experimenter was still a white man in his 30s, he still wore the lab coat, and his confederate, the person that was in on the experiment, who was the learner, was in his 50s. Now, the script resembled Milgram's, but he did change certain things. So, for example, the test shock that the teacher was given at the beginning to prove that the experiment is real, Milgram obviously gave a 45-volt shock, whereas Berger said that was too distressing, so he actually only gave a 15-volt shock, which isn't as painful. Now, the participant, which was the teacher, watched the learner being strapped into the chair exactly the same, sat in front of the shock generator in the adjacent room. Teacher read out 25 multiple choice questions and the learner used a buzzer to indicate the answer. If they were wrong, the experimenter gave a shock and the shocks went up in 15-volt intervals, the same as Milgram. Now, the learner indicated that they had a slight heart condition, but the experiment replied that the shocks would not be harmful. At 75 volts, the learner could be heard making the screams of pain, and at 150 volts, the learner cried that they didn't want to take part in the experiment anymore, they didn't want it to continue, their heart was too bad. If the teacher moved to deliver a shock past 150 volts, if they went to deliver the 165 volt shock, the experimenter stopped the experiment. Now, Berger has a very scientific approach because he uses this idea of empathy and locus of control as an extraneous variable that he says Milgram didn't control. Now, Berger argues that by controlling this extraneous variable, he's able to draw a much better cause and effect relationship between the IV and the DV. Now, Berger measures these traits, this empathy and locus of control, by giving all participants a questionnaire beforehand to see how high or low their empathy or locus of control is. And then at the end, he wants to see if there's a statistic. Now, the results of this were that Berger found that 70% of participants in the baseline condition were prepared to go past 150 volts. Now, he compares this to the 82.5% in Milgram's variation number 5. Now, note here that obviously we know in Milgram's original study the amount of participants that went up to 450 volts was 65%. Don't get confused here, Berger's based his study on the variation number 5, in which the results were 82.5. Now, this sounds like a really big difference, but actually it's not significantly, statistically significant when you take into account the number of participants that were involved. He also found that men and women made no difference. Women were slightly less likely to obey in the model refusal condition, but this wasn't statistically significant either. Empathy made no significant difference to the obedience levels, but in the base condition, those who stopped at 150 volts or sooner did have a significantly higher locus of control, but this wasn't the case within the model refusal condition. Now, Berger concludes that Milgram's results still stand half a century later. People are still influenced by these situational factors to obey, even if it goes against their morals. Now, the model refusal results were not very different from the baseline condition, which is interesting if you think about social impact theory, because social impact theory would suggest that having two teachers would lessen the impact of the authority figure rather than it all being focused on one, but that's not the case in this situation. Now, Milgram did actually find less obedience when he did his variation, which included 2 rebellious models and not 1, so maybe that can account for the difference. Empathy didn't make a big difference to the obedience, which is actually going against what Milgram thought. Locus of control did make a bit of difference, suggesting that some people can resist the agentic state. But actually this disappeared within the model refusal condition, and Berger can't explain why that is. It's important to note here when evaluating Berger that you need to use grave, and you need to P every single point. Looking at Berger's study in terms of strengths and weaknesses, if we start with generalisability, Berger's sample had 70 participants, so obviously that's bigger than Milgram's original sample of 40, and he manages to cover a wider range of ages, so he actually looks at 20 to 81-year-olds, 2/3 of the sample were women, whereas all of Milgram's were men. However, you need to be really careful when you mention this, because if you actually add up all of Milgram's variation studies, he had a lot more than 70 participants, and he did actually test women in variation number 8. We could also argue that Berger excluded people from his sample, so people who'd studied psychology or had emotional issues, and actually this could have been what affected the results, because Milgram used a wider range of different types of people. Now, Milgram's original procedure is obviously very reliable because it can be replicated. Berger's obviously just replicated it. Now, in 1974, Milgram published the results of his 19 variations, and Berger is replicating aspects of variation number 5, variation number 17, and variation number 8 by testing women. Berger also was able to follow a Milgram script wherever possible and use the same confederates every single time. The whole experiment was filmed as well, and by Berger doing this, he allows for inter-rater reliability, so he's got somebody else there with him checking the conclusions that he makes and thus avoiding subjectivity as well. Now, this study demonstrates how obedience to authority works, and this can be really useful to us if we start looking at settings like schools and workplaces and prisons. We can take some of the conclusions of this study, such as authority figures, in order to assert that authority, need to be wearing a uniform, or they need to be able to justify their authority with a reference to a greater good. Now, what Berger tries to do is he replicates Milgram's study, but he also tries to correct some of the errors or the things that he thinks Milgram's missed. Now, in this case, obviously Milgram was particularly unethical. Milgram's shocks went all the way to 450 volts, and his participants were seen to become quite distressed within the later stages of this. Now, Berger points out that any of the participants who did drop out, validity, so does this measure what it's supposed to measure? Now, because the participants were paid fully in advance, which we talked about at the beginning, we can be fairly sure that it was the social pressure that affected the DV that made them continue shocking, and not a cost-benefit situation where they just wanted to carry on because they wanted to get paid. However, when we look at validity, it can still be criticised exactly the same as Milgram for lacking this ecological validity, because the task is still artificial. It is not a real-life situation to be asked to electrocute a different person behind a screen just because they're not getting a learning pair answer correctly, and this criticism can be applied to both Berger and Milgram. The whole experiment was filmed as well, and by Berger doing this, he allows for inter-rater reliability, so he's got somebody else there with him checking the conclusions that he makes and thus avoiding subjectivity as well. Now, this study demonstrates how obedience to authority works, and this can be really useful to us if we start looking at settings like schools and workplaces and prisons. We can take some of the conclusions of this study, such as authority figures, in order to assert that authority, need to be wearing. Now, the study was approved by the ethics panel, who had the power to shut it down if they thought anybody was being harmed, and Berger also reduced that test shock from 45 to 15 volts, saying that it didn't justify giving the participants any pain. He also stopped the experiment at 150 volts, so he didn't make anybody go all the way to 450 volts, and it was argued that it was going to the 450 volts that caused that distress within Milgram's participants. However, Berger did fall foul the same as Milgram did in terms of deception. Now, Berger still lied to his participants about the extent of what the experiment was about. He did not gain their informed consent. He also told the participants, obviously, the experiment was real when they weren't real. It was exactly the same tape recording that was given to every single different participant that took part. The bit I want you to be really aware of here is within the new specification of Edexcel Psychology is this introduction of the 8-mark question. Now, even if you're given an evaluate one contemporary study from social psychology, straight away we know our contemporary study from social psychology is Berger. But because it's an 8-mark evaluate question, we also need to be aware that we have to describe and evaluate for the full 8 marks. So we've got 4 marks for our AO1 and our description, and 4 marks for our AO3, which is our evaluation. There is a model answer for this within your booklets that I suggest you read. Also, I'm going to tip you off. I think you need to be able to be aware of comparing Milgram and Berger in terms of the model refusal and the baseline condition. And get prepared for a question that might ask you to compare Milgram with a more up-to-date or a more recent study that looks at obedience. And obviously we would use Berger for that.